Picture this. You are standing in the marble corridors of a Roman villa at dusk. Oil lamps flicker against walls painted with mythic scenes, Venus rising from the sea, Hercules in triumph, while the air breathes with the mingled scents of rose oil, burning incense, and faintly metallic notes from bronze fittings. Behind thin fabric partitions, whispers rise and fall, a domina and her slave girls plotting tomorrow's beauty rituals, murmuring in the hushed tones of conspiracy. These small, private sounds, bare feet padding over mosaic floors, the clank of glass jars filled with oils and powders, seem almost louder against the silence of grandeur. A senator's wife emerges from her private chambers, her face unnaturally pale beneath a mask of white lead, her lips crimson from mercury-stained cosmetics. Each step she takes is graceful, trained, almost ritualistic. Yet behind the elegance lies something heavier, customs so alien to us that they shimmer like fever dreams. She drifts toward her husband's study, where important guests wait, carrying on her skin the slow poison that will corrode her from within. But this is not just vanity. It is theater, politics performed through flesh. In Rome, beauty was not simply personal adornment. It was a declaration of status, a visible marker of power. The whiteness of her face signified wealth, for only those who never labored beneath the sun could maintain such pallor. The glittering powders and costly perfumes were not luxuries but necessities, tokens of her husband's influence. Even her silence was a performance, for Roman matrons were expected to embody dignity through restraint. Before we step deeper into these forgotten chambers of survival and suffering, pause for a moment. Think of how intimacy, what we today might call private, personal moments, was never truly private in Rome. Grooming habits, family rituals, even the marriage bed itself were bound up in laws, religion, and social codes. What seems like love to us was in Rome a transaction. What feels like a personal choice was then a duty tied to one's place in the hierarchy. The senator's wife, painted and perfumed, was less a free woman than a living emblem of her husband's honor. Consider the Roman concept of beauty not as self-expression, but as a kind of warfare. A wife's appearance could raise or ruin her household's reputation. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History, cataloged recipes for cosmetics with the same precision he used for poisons, because in truth they were often the same. White lead, cinnabar, antimony, the ingredients of allure were also instruments of slow death. Yet Roman women endured them willingly, because fashion in Rome was survival. You might imagine this woman pausing in the corridor, her painted lips curving in a faint smile as she glides toward her husband's guests. Perhaps she knows her beauty is a mask that costs her health, perhaps even her life. But to refuse would be unthinkable, for in this world a woman's body was not her own. It was Rome's stage. And so intimacy in ancient Rome begins not in the bedchamber, but in these corridors, half-lit, perfumed, heavy with whispers. It is here that the threads of politics and power, beauty and suffering weave themselves into the very fabric of private life. What we call intimacy today, love, trust, personal choice, was in Rome a public performance, bound by iron expectations. The flicker of oil lamps hides more than it reveals, and the walls themselves seem to lean in, listening, as though they too know that the most dangerous secrets are carried not in words, but in the silence of painted faces and poisoned skin.
In 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius erupted, it buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under a suffocating rain of ash and pumice. The eruption silenced an entire region in hours, but in doing so, it preserved something extraordinary, not just bodies and buildings, but the very texture of daily Roman life. The frescoes, the graffiti, the intimate objects tucked away in drawers and alcoves, all of it frozen in time, waiting to speak across 2 millennia. Walk through Pompeii's streets today, and you move through a ghost city where whispers of private lives echo louder than the clamor of markets or the spectacle of amphitheaters. Bedrooms reveal frescoes that leave nothing to imagination, scenes of gods and mortals entangled, depictions so explicit that, when first discovered in the 18th century, excavators locked them away in Naples' so-called gabinetto segreto, the secret cabinet, fearing they were too indecent for public eyes. Yet, for the Romans, these were not indecent. They were normal, even sacred, images of fertility, pleasure, and power. Bathhouses tell us more still. Their mosaics mapped hierarchies of behavior, guiding patrons from hot rooms to cold plunges, from massage tables to alcoves where whispered negotiations unfolded. To bathe was to socialize, to be seen, to transact, sometimes with coin, sometimes with flesh. Seneca's complaints about the sounds from the bathhouse beneath his home, grunting from weights, cries of tweezers ripping hair, and low murmurs of forbidden bargains, become vivid when you step into Pompeii's vaulted steam rooms, their plastered walls still carrying the marks of hands that once leaned against them. Even graffiti preserves the intimacies of the forgotten. A scribble on a brothel wall reads, "Restituta, you move so sweetly." Another boasts of conquest, a crude reminder that Rome's private moments were often transactional, layered with desire and domination. These scratches of charcoal and stylus were not meant for eternity, but the ash made them immortal. But perhaps most haunting are the plaster casts of human figures. Archaeologists poured liquid plaster into voids left by decayed bodies, revealing people in their final postures. A man shielding his face, a child curled beside her mother, a dog straining at its chain. Among them are also figures found in bedrooms and courtyards, sometimes in positions that suggest intimate acts interrupted by catastrophe. In death, they tell us not just of terror, but of how ordinary and extraordinary moments blurred when Vesuvius struck. What shocks us today is not merely the erotic frescoes or the blunt graffiti, but how seamlessly these elements were woven into the fabric of Roman existence. Intimacy in Pompeii was not hidden in shame. It was painted on walls, etched into public spaces, celebrated at festivals. The ash preserved a mirror that refuses to flatter us. It shows a culture where pleasure, power, and survival mingled openly, and where the boundaries between sacred and profane dissolved in the heat of volcanic dust. Standing among these ruins, it becomes clear the eruption did not only destroy a city, it preserved a truth, that Roman intimacy was never private, never simple, and never innocent. It was part of the machinery of life, politics, and power, etched into walls as boldly as laws carved into stone.
Among the many words the Romans used to describe virtue, few carried as much weight or as much danger as pudicitia. The word is often translated as chastity or modesty, but to stop there is to miss its deeper meaning. For Roman women, pudicitia was not a private moral choice. It was a public performance, a fragile balance between availability and restraint, judged not by the woman herself, but by the men who surrounded her. A senator's wife, for example, was expected to embody pudicitia so precisely that even the smallest deviation could dishonor her household. She had to be sexually available to her husband, yet utterly inaccessible to all others. Her body was not her own. It was a mirror of her husband's political standing, a vessel through which his reputation was measured.
A whisper of infidelity, even without proof, could end careers, topple alliances, and unravel years of calculated ambition. No one mastered this burden more completely than Livia Drusilla, wife of the first emperor Augustus. To the public eye, Livia became the model of Roman feminine virtue, embodying dignity, loyalty, and restraint. But behind closed doors, she was said to command a network of informants, slave girls embedded in the households of Rome's elite, feeding her information about the intimate habits of her husband's rivals. What Augustus projected as moral order, Livia sharpened into political survival. She understood that in Rome, secrets whispered in bedrooms could destabilize empires as effectively as legions on campaign. The cult of Pudicitia itself reflected this paradox. There were temples dedicated to her, one reserved for patrician women, another for plebeians. To worship at these shrines was not an act of private devotion, but of public allegiance, a declaration that one's household remained intact, honorable, untarnished. Inscriptions on altars praised women as univerae, wives of one man only, women who embodied lifelong fidelity. Yet these same women might live in marriages arranged for politics, bear children for dynastic necessity, and conceal private resentments beneath the polished marble of public virtue. The philosopher Cicero once argued that Pudicitia was the foundation of the republic, for if women strayed, the stability of the household, and therefore the state, crumbled. His words reveal the true weight of this ideal. It was not just a feminine virtue, but a political one. The body of a Roman matron became an extension of the Roman state, regulated, observed, and judged. And yet Pudicitia was also a weapon. A woman who cultivated the image of flawless modesty could wield enormous influence. By projecting purity, she could silence rumors, strengthen alliances, and elevate her family's prestige. To accuse a rival of lacking pudicitia was to brand her entire household with shame. Roman courts did not need evidence of adultery to ruin a woman. Mere suggestion, whispered at a banquet or recorded in a satire, could stain her reputation permanently. Think of the weight of such a performance. Every gesture, how a woman walked, how she dressed, how she interacted with men outside her household was scrutinized. The saffron-dyed veil she wore in public marked her status as a married woman, but it also marked her as a target for judgment. A laugh too loud, an eye lingering too long, could spark accusations. To be a Roman matron was to live in a theater where the audience never slept. And yet, despite the suffocating rules, there were women who turned Pudicitia into power. Livia did it through information. Others, like Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi brothers, did it through rhetoric, celebrated for raising her sons as her jewels, embodying virtue not in submission, but in motherhood. In their stories, we glimpse the complexity of a Roman ideal that on the surface demanded silence, but in practice could empower the very women it sought to restrain. The whispers in those corridors, then, were never just about perfumes or powders. They were about survival in a system where a woman's honor was never truly her own, but always the currency of men. Pudicitia was both a burden and a blade, binding women in silence, yet arming them with influence. And in Rome, that influence could shape the destiny of empires.
If love was the dream, marriage in Rome was the contract. Among the elite, weddings were not unions of hearts, but negotiations between households, carefully calculated to secure wealth, forge political alliances, and guarantee legitimate heirs. Families did not ask, "Whom do you love?" but rather, "Whom should we bind ourselves to in order to rise?" The bride herself was rarely consulted. More often, she was a bargaining chip. Her youth and fertility weighed against her father's political ambitions and her husband's lineage. Roman law made clear that marriage was not about companionship, but about property, inheritance, and the continuation of family honor. Love, if it appeared later, was considered a pleasant accident, but never the foundation. The night of the wedding often revealed this most starkly. Imagine the scene described by Pliny the Younger in a letter dated 97 AD. A girl of only 14, trembling as her mother and aunts prepared her for the ceremony. The saffron veil was placed upon her head, her hair carefully parted with the hasta calibaris, a spear once used in battle, symbolizing both fertility and the courage expected of her in childbirth. She had scarcely emerged from childhood, yet by dawn she would be a wife. In the adjoining chamber, her husband waited, 20 years older, a man already seasoned by politics and ambition. The bride's family whispered instructions she could barely comprehend. Her duty was to submit, to ensure the union was consummated, to prove by blood that she had fulfilled the first expectation of a Roman marriage. The marriage bed itself was sanctified with sacred water and draped with fabrics dyed the precise shade of red that would conceal her virginity's loss. It was not intimacy she entered, but ritual. Weddings themselves were grand performances, blending religion, law, and theater. Witnesses gathered as the bride was formally handed from father to husband, a symbolic transfer of authority. She was carried across the threshold of her new home to prevent evil spirits from clinging to her feet. Nuts and fruits were scattered by children to invite fertility. Every gesture mattered, each a coded signal to the gods, the ancestors, and the watching community that this union was not just private, but civic, a matter that bound the Republic together. To modern eyes, such marriages seem cold, transactional, stripped of tenderness. Yet within them, affection sometimes bloomed. Ancient letters and epitaphs tell us of couples who found companionship in their arranged unions, who learned to laugh together, to grieve together, and to love despite the odds. But equally, they tell us of women consumed by isolation, children forced into roles they could neither understand nor refuse, and men who saw their wives less as partners than as vessels for legacy. Marriage in Rome was at its heart a contract of power. To wed a senator's daughter was to gain entry into the highest circles of governance. To marry into wealth was to secure the lifeblood of estates and armies. For women, the stakes were no less high, but their agency was bound by expectation. They were the threads stitching together alliances, but threads can be pulled, and once unraveled, they left only ruin. So, when we imagine Roman weddings, let us not picture only garlands and laughter. Picture also the fear behind the veil, the calculations whispered between fathers, the weight of futures decided long before the bride stepped across the threshold. Marriage was never simply personal. It was the empire itself, written into flesh and law.
In Rome, intimacy was never just about two people. It was about categories, roles, and hierarchies so precise that they carved human relationships into a map of power. A Roman citizen was not simply male or female, husband or wife. He or she was a node in an intricate system where citizenship, freedom, wealth, and gender dictated what kinds of desire were permitted and what kinds could destroy you. A Roman citizen man, for example, could engage sexually with slaves, prostitutes, or foreigners without fear of social censure. Such acts did not touch his honor because those partners existed outside the boundaries of civic respectability. But if he crossed into the realm of another citizen's wife or daughter, the rules changed. Suddenly, what had been private became political. A potential threat not only to family honor, but to Rome's social fabric. The case of Gaius Silius and Valeria Messalina reveals this dangerous calculus. Silius, a respected senator, entered into a relationship with Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, in 48 AD. Some sources even claim they held a marriage ceremony while Claudius was away from Rome. Whether the marriage was legal mattered less than its symbolism. It was a challenge to imperial authority. To possess the emperor's wife was to stake a claim to his throne. When Claudius returned, both Silius and Messalina were executed, their downfall not a matter of private scandal, but of treason. Adultery here was no longer about love or betrayal. It was about power. and who was allowed to wield it. This layered understanding of desire meant that Roman sexuality cannot be neatly compared to our modern categories of orientation. It was less about who you loved than about who you dominated. To be penetrated, whether by a man or a woman, was to risk shame if you were a freeborn citizen male. To take the active role, however, was to reaffirm your status so long as your partner remained outside the circle of civic honor. Rome's sexual morality was thus not morality at all in our sense, but hierarchy in motion. These boundaries were not abstract. They were enforced by law, by satire, by rumor. The poet Juvenal mocked men who lost themselves in scandalous affairs with citizen women while celebrating their freedom to indulge with slaves or prostitutes. Legal penalties for adultery were severe, but not evenly distributed. A husband could kill his wife's lover if caught in the act, yet a wife had no such right against her husband. Women were expected to embody fidelity, men to embody dominance. What emerges is a world where intimacy was another form of governance. Who you touched, how you touched them, and whether you were praised or punished depended entirely on your place in the hierarchy. The bedroom was a microcosm of the Republic and later the Empire, a place where politics seeped into skin, where the private body became the battleground of public power. And so Roman desire was not a free, natural expression of human longing. It was a ladder of dominance, each rung marked by law, custom, and danger. Climb it wrongly, and you might fall into disgrace, or worse, as Gaius Silius discovered, into death itself.
If intimacy in Rome was bound by hierarchy, nowhere was that hierarchy more brutally exposed than in the relationship between masters and slaves. To Roman eyes, the enslaved were not individuals with rights, but living tools, extensions of their master's body, available for any use, domestic, economic, or sexual. Consent was irrelevant. Law did not recognize the enslaved as protectors of their own bodies. To own a slave was, by definition, to own access. Within wealthy households, this reality was institutionalized with frightening precision. Certain slaves were trained for cosmetics, mixing perfumes, applying lead-based powders, crafting hairstyles that could take hours to assemble. Others, called cubiculari, were assigned specifically to bedroom service, preparing the bed, attending the couple, sometimes even acting as intermediaries in the act itself. Beyond them were concubines, enslaved women or men kept for ongoing sexual relationships that ran parallel to legal marriages. The scale of such arrangements could be staggering. Marcus Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, reportedly maintained over 500 slaves in his urban household alone. Among them were dozens chosen for their beauty, trained not only in music, poetry, and dance, but in the more intimate arts of entertainment. Evening gatherings might blur the lines between banquet, theater, and exploitation, songs and recitations flowing seamlessly into acts that today we would call abuse, but which Rome understood as privilege. Nor was this confined to the elite. Even modest households often had one or two enslaved persons pressed into similar roles. A craftsman might own a young slave girl, tasked with both sweeping floors and warming his bed. For her, there was no division between labor and intimacy. They were the same. Yet within this system of possession, strange complexities emerged. Some masters grew emotionally attached to their enslaved companions, freeing them in wills or elevating them to favored status. Inscriptions on tombstones sometimes describe slaves not as property, but as faithful friend or beloved companion.
These words reveal the contradictions at the heart of Roman slavery: affection entangled with ownership, intimacy entangled with exploitation. The law, however, remained clear. Children born to enslaved women were automatically the property of the master, regardless of paternity. A man could father his own children with a concubine and still sell them at market. This legal reality meant that entire families, wives, husbands, children, could be broken apart without consequence. Even love itself, for the enslaved, was a dangerous luxury. And yet, despite everything, humanity persisted. Archaeological evidence shows couples among the enslaved who lived as though married, forming bonds recognized informally by households, if not by law. They held each other in defiance of a world that denied their personhood, crafting small islands of tenderness in an ocean of ownership. When we look at Rome's gleaming marble villas and imagine the grandeur of its elite, we must also see these hidden lives. The woman applying toxic powders to her mistress's face, the youth trained to sing at banquets before being led into darker chambers, the child born not as a son or daughter, but as an asset. All of them were threads in Rome's fabric of intimacy. For the Romans, slaves were extensions of flesh. For the slaves themselves, every act of touch carried the weight of survival.
If Roman villas were theaters of private performance, the bathhouse was its public stage. To bathe in Rome was not merely to cleanse the body, it was to enter a carefully orchestrated social arena where class, power, and desire played themselves out in steam and stone. Most Roman cities, from the grandeur of the capital to the smallest provincial towns, boasted bathhouses. These were feats of engineering, soaring vaulted ceilings, hypocaust systems that piped hot air beneath marble floors, pools of varying temperatures to shock and soothe the body. The baths were democratic in principle. Citizens of all classes could enter for a modest fee, but once inside, hierarchies reasserted themselves. Wealthy men arrived with entourages, their bodies oiled and massaged by attendants, while the poor had to settle for crowded pools and shared towels. Yet within these walls, bathing was only part of the experience. The bathhouse was also a gymnasium, a meeting hall, a marketplace of whispers. Political deals were struck beside cold plunges. Business contracts were discussed while sweating in the caldarium. And beneath the hiss of steam and the scrape of strigils on oiled skin, other negotiations took place. Whispered bargains between bathers and attendants, some subtle, some explicit. Seneca the Younger, who lived above a bathhouse in Rome, wrote bitterly of the noises that rose each evening, the groans of men lifting weights, the cries of those being depilated with tweezers, the shouts of drink sellers hawking cheap wine, and beneath it all, the murmur of private arrangements, services not written on any notice board, but known to all. His irritation reveals more than annoyance. It shows how deeply sexuality had seeped into even Rome's public institutions. Archaeology supports this. In Pompeii and Ostia, inscriptions and graffiti inside bathhouses point to encounters that went beyond casual flirtation. Some baths even included small, dim side chambers, too narrow for lounging, yet perfectly suited for brief, discreet encounters. The line between recreation and commerce blurred, just as the line between friendship and desire dissolved in the steam. And though most facilities kept men and women separate, moments of mingling were not uncommon. Some emperors banned mixed bathing entirely, declaring it immoral. Others, like Elagabalus, encouraged it, delighting in the spectacle.
Rules shifted with the times, but temptation and transgression always found a way to return. The bathhouse was not a brothel, yet it was haunted by the same energies: the hunger for touch, the thrill of risk, the quiet trade of bodies. For Rome, this was not contradiction, but continuity. To strip off your toga and step into the steam was to shed not only dirt, but pretense. For a few hours, senators and commoners, soldiers and shopkeepers all moved in a world where the body spoke louder than law. The bathhouse was a mirror of Roman intimacy, structured by rules yet alive with transgression. It was a place where pleasure was never far from power, and where the simple act of cleansing oneself became a ritual layered with politics, commerce, and desire.
To the Romans, smooth skin was not just fashion, it was a declaration of civility, a mark that separated the cultivated from the barbarian. Hairlessness was refinement, body hair was shame. And so, men and women alike pursued depilation with a zeal that bordered on obsession, enduring procedures that were as brutal as they were fashionable. The wealthy employed slaves trained specifically for this task, known as alipilari. Their sole duty was to remove hair, strand by strand, with instruments that burned, tore, or scraped. Heated bronze tweezers plucked at follicles until the skin was raw. Pine resin and wax, spread hot and ripped away, left welts that lingered for days. Pumice stones were rubbed against flesh until the skin itself seemed to wear thin. Pain was not incidental, it was expected, endured in silence as proof of discipline and dignity. Martial, the sharp-tongued poet of the 1st century A.D., described watching a senator's wife undergoing such a session. She lay perfectly still as her slave girl pressed hot tweezers to her arms, her legs, even to the most intimate places. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks, but she did not make a sound. To cry out would have marked her as weak, unworthy of the stoic composure demanded of a Roman matron. Hours later, her body was left bleeding, her skin raw, yet praised as flawless, smooth as ivory, a testament to wealth and restraint. Depilation was not vanity alone, it was morality etched into flesh. To be unkempt was to invite mockery, even suspicion of barbarism. Roman writers often sneered at hairy Gauls or unkempt Germans, contrasting them with Rome's cultivated citizens. A woman who neglected her beauty rituals risked not only ridicule, but the suggestion that she lacked pudicizia, that sacred modesty expected of her. Her smoothness was her husband's honor, her silence in pain, his reputation. And this obsession was not limited to women. Men, too, were expected to maintain polished appearances, though the line was fine. A man too well-groomed risked accusations of effeminacy, while one too rough risked charges of vulgarity. Satirists delighted in exposing men who crossed this boundary, mocking them as unmanly, even as they praised the discipline of those who bore depilation's torments in silence. To our eyes, these rituals seem barbaric, yet perhaps they are not so distant. Today, needles pierce skin for Botox, scalpels cut for cosmetic surgery, chemicals burn in hair removal creams. We too demand smoothness, youth, perfection, often at the cost of pain, money, even health. The Roman matron enduring hours beneath the tweezers may not be so far from the modern woman beneath the surgeon's knife. Both are captives of beauty's silent tyranny. In the marble chambers of Rome, beauty came with blood. The price of elegance was suffering, and the performance of refinement was written into the body itself. To be Roman was to endure,
to show no weakness, to let the skin speak the language of power, even as it bled beneath the touch of bronze. If hairless skin marked refinement, then a painted face was the mask of Roman power. Yet the paints and powders that signaled beauty were also instruments of slow destruction. Every application was a gamble, every gesture toward elegance a step toward decay. The most prized cosmetic was the white face paint made from lead carbonate, applied thickly across the cheeks and forehead. To Roman eyes, pale skin was the emblem of nobility, proof that a woman had never labored beneath the sun. But the lead seeped silently into the body, corroding nerves, poisoning blood, unraveling fertility. Women who wore it daily suffered trembling hands, clouded minds, and early death. Their painted beauty was a mask that consumed them from within. For lips and cheeks, cinnabar, mercury sulfide, was crushed into powder and blended with fat and oils. It gave a brilliant red glow, a symbol of vitality, even seduction. Yet cinnabar released mercury into the bloodstream, gnawing at the nervous system, causing madness, paralysis, and slow deterioration. To redden the lips was to court both allure and ruin. Kohl eyeliners imported from the East darkened the eyes with lines drawn in antimony and soot. These widened the gaze, deepened the stare, gave the matron the aura of divine statues. But antimony, too, was toxic, seeping into the skin, corroding health in ways unseen until it was too late. The very paints that promised immortality and beauty whispered death beneath their brilliance. Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, did not shy from describing these rituals with unnerving cheer. His recipes read like incantations. Mix white lead with vinegar until smooth. Apply thickly to the face and neck. For lips, crush cinnabar with rose oil and fat. For the eyes, combine antimony with honey and wine. To follow these instructions was to embrace a kind of slow suicide, one performed in the name of elegance. But this was more than vanity, it was duty. A Roman matron's painted face was not only her own, it was her husband's honor, her household's reputation, her family's public mask. The pale skin, the crimson lips, the darkened eyes were not mere beauty, they were status carved into flesh. To appear otherwise was to risk suspicion, ridicule, even disgrace. And so each morning, women sat before polished bronze mirrors, surrounded by jars of powders and oils. Slave girls ground minerals into paste, mixed them with vinegar and fat, and smeared them across their mistress's face. The air in those chambers was heavy with metallic tangs and acrid fumes. To breathe there was to inhale poison. To live there was to shorten one's years. Yet to refuse was unthinkable. It is easy, perhaps, to condemn these women for their vanity. But is it vanity or survival? In a culture where beauty was tied to honor, where a painted face could elevate or destroy an entire household, to embrace poison was not foolishness, but obedience. They painted themselves not for pleasure, but for Rome, wearing death like perfume. In the marble corridors where we first met them, their faces gleamed with deadly brilliance, each smile edged with crimson that would one day still the heart. Theirs was a beauty that glowed, then withered, leaving behind not youth or charm, but the silence of early graves. Rome demanded elegance, and it exacted the price in flesh.
If beauty demanded sacrifice, so too did the desperate attempt to control fertility. Roman women lived in a world where pregnancy was both blessing and burden, a duty of marriage, yet a risk to health, autonomy, and life itself.
And so, they turned to remedies that were as dangerous as the conditions they sought to prevent. The most famous of these was silthium, a plant harvested along the coast of Cyrenaica in modern Libya. Shaped like a giant fennel, it was praised for its almost miraculous power to prevent conception. So prized was it that silthium was stamped onto coins, traded for its weight in silver, and guarded like treasure. Women consumed it in small doses to delay or avoid pregnancy, but its potency was perilous. An extra sprig, a spoonful too much, could prove fatal. By the 1st century AD, silphium had been harvested into extinction. Its demand so insatiable that an entire species vanished, swallowed by Rome's hunger for control over the body. Other methods were cruder, more desperate. Cyrannus of Ephesus, a Greek physician practicing in Rome in the 2nd century AD, recorded a range of contraceptive and abortive practices in his Gynecology. Some women inserted wool soaked in honey, cedar resin, or vinegar before intercourse. Others drank concoctions of copper sulfate, iron rust, or even crushed beetles, remedies as repulsive as they were dangerous. Still others sought to prevent conception by violence, vigorous exercise, leaping from heights, plunging into scalding baths, or deliberately falling. Each method carried its own risks, each a gamble with health and survival. Abortion, though legally permitted, was far more perilous. Roman law regarded the fetus as part of the mother's body, not an independent life, but the means of termination were brutal. Women consumed toxic plants like pennyroyal, rue, or savin, herbs that induced miscarriages by poisoning the entire system. Some underwent mechanical procedures with bronze instruments, inserted with crude force, often resulting in hemorrhage, infection, or death. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, described one such case. A wealthy woman, desperate to end an unwanted pregnancy, consumed herbs for days without result. Growing weaker, she consented to a physician's instruments. She bit down on a leather strap as her female relatives held her still. The procedure succeeded in ending the pregnancy, but within days, infection spread through her body. She died in agony, her family whispering to neighbors that it was a fever, too ashamed to admit the truth. These stories remind us that the desire to control reproduction is as old as civilization itself. Women risked their lives not because they were careless, but because society gave them little choice. For many Roman matrons, too many pregnancies could destroy their health, too many children could dilute family wealth, and scandal from an illicit liaison could ruin everything. In this world, dangerous remedies became their only recourse, a fragile rebellion against a system that demanded fertility yet offered no protection. And though the methods shock us, poisons, knives, and desperate leaps, perhaps they should not. Even today, women in parts of the world still face choices just as perilous, still risking their lives in pursuit of autonomy denied. The faces may change, the remedies may differ, but the desperation is hauntingly familiar. In Rome, fertility was power, but to control it was peril. And in the margins of medicine, whispered between midwives and slaves, women carried secrets as dangerous as any weapon, secrets not written in ink or law, but in blood and silence. To understand Roman sexuality, one must set aside modern categories of orientation. For the Romans, love between men or between women was not judged by attraction itself, but by hierarchy. Desire was permissible, even celebrated, provided it respected boundaries of dominance and submission. To be active was honorable, to be passive could be ruinous. A Roman citizen male, for instance, could take a slave, a freedman, or a foreigner as a lover without fear of scandal. These partners were outside the circle of civic honor, and their subordination confirmed his status. But should that same citizen take the passive role, even willingly, his reputation would collapse. Penetration was not simply an act of intimacy, it was a symbol of power. To be penetrated meant to be dominated, to be less than a man, unworthy of authority. Few stories reveal this more vividly than the rumors that dogged Julius Caesar. During his youth, he spent time at the court of King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia. Political enemies seized on whispers that Caesar had served as the king's passive partner. They mocked him as the Queen of Bithynia, hissing insults that clung to him long after his victories. It mattered little whether the accusations were true. What mattered was the perception that a Roman general had surrendered his dignity in the bedchamber. For in Rome, sexual submission equated to political submission. Even emperors were not immune. Hadrian's love for Antoninus, a youth of striking beauty, scandalized some of his contemporaries not because it was homosexual, but because it seemed too tender. When Antoninus drowned in the Nile in 130 AD, Hadrian's grief was overwhelming. He deified the boy, erected statues of him across the empire, and even founded a city in his name. To some Romans, these acts reveal dangerous weakness, a ruler ruled by love, not by reason. His devotion blurred the line between proper dominance and emotional vulnerability, a violation of Rome's unspoken code. Women, too, appear in these narratives, though far less often, filtered through the voices of male authors. Satires and love poetry occasionally depict women taking female lovers, sometimes mocked as deviant, other times exoticized as curiosities. Martial, in one of his epigrams, sneers at a woman who preferred women to men, branding her unnatural. Yet beneath the ridicule, these fragments reveal that female same-sex desire existed openly enough to provoke commentary. What emerges is not a society devoid of same-sex relationships, but one where desire itself was secondary to power. The active partner, whether with a man or woman, retained dignity. The passive partner risked dishonor if freeborn, or invisibility if enslaved. Love was entangled with dominance. Intimacy was never free of hierarchy. And so when we picture Roman lovers beneath frescoed ceilings or in garden alcoves, we must imagine more than passion. We must see the invisible scaffolding of status that determined who could love whom and at what cost. In Rome, desire could build a reputation or destroy it. To be touched was never just to be touched. It was to be measured, weighed, and judged by the unyielding standards of honor and power.
When passion burned too fiercely, or when it went unreturned, Romans turned to the shadows of magic. In whispered prayers and secret rituals, they sought to bind hearts, ignite desire, or exact revenge. Love was not only a matter for poets and gods, it was also a battlefield of spells, herbs, and curses. Apuleius, in his Apologia, tells of women accused of enchanting their husbands with philters, love potions brewed from herbs, blood, or stranger ingredients. These concoctions promised devotion, but often delivered poison. A sip too strong could leave a man fevered, delirious, or dead. Yet the demand never ceased. For the powerless, especially women without legal control over inheritance or fidelity, magic offered what law denied: influence over the heart of a man. The recipes varied. Some combined wine with mandrake root, henbane, or cantharides, the notorious Spanish fly, a blistering agent, said to stir lust, but equally likely to burn the throat or inflame the bladder. Others mixed blood, ashes, or bodily fluids, mingling desire with revulsion. The line between medicine and sorcery was perilously thin, and in the dim light of a Roman kitchen, a potion could be salvation or murder. But where potions failed, curses began.
Across the empire, archaeologists have unearthed depicciones, thin sheets of lead inscribed with words of binding, and then folded, pierced with nails, and cast into wells, graves with sanctuaries. Some called upon gods of the underworld, like Hecate or Pluto, to chain a lover's will. Others dripped with desperation, pleading, "May she burn with desire for me. May she be unable to eat, sleep, or find joy until she comes into my arms." Desire here was weaponized, twisted into torment. And yet, curses were not limited to longing. They could punish betrayal. A spurned lover might write a curse to strip beauty from a rival, or to bring impotence upon a faithless husband. The same words that once sought passion could just as easily summon ruin. Magic, though condemned by law, persisted in the cracks of Roman society. Officially, Rome prided itself on reason, medicine, and law. But in practice, love remained untamable, and in that chaos, the occult thrived. Whether through filters that blurred the boundary of healing and harm, or curses buried in the earth, Romans confessed, silently, that desire was stronger than discipline. And perhaps that is why the poets so often wrote of love as madness. For in Rome, love could not simply be chosen. It could be brewed, bound, or bewitched. And in that fragile space between longing and obsession, the human heart was never safe.
To the Romans, marriage was far more than a union of two hearts. It was a civic duty, a ritual through which families bound their fortunes, bloodlines, and gods together. A wedding was never simply private. It was a stage where tradition, religion, and power performed in perfect harmony. On the chosen day, the bride would don a flame-colored veil, the flammeum, its fiery hue symbolizing both fertility and the sacred hearth of Vesta. Beneath it, her hair was parted with a spear, a gesture that reminded all present of Rome's founding myth, that marriages, like the city itself, were born in conquest and strength. Around her waist, a knotted girdle bound her chastity, a knot only her husband was permitted to untie. The ceremony began with auspices, omens read to ensure the gods approved. Without divine favor, no marriage could stand. Then came the sacrifice, often of a pig, its blood sealing the contract, not just between man and woman, but between their households and ancestors. Only after the smoke had risen could the vows be spoken, words of fidelity, whispered not for romance, but for order. And yet, amid the solemnity, there was tenderness. The bride was led from her father's home in a torchlit procession, surrounded by laughter, songs, and playful teasing. Neighbors shouted ribald jokes, believing obscenity would ward off evil spirits. Children carried branches, symbols of fertility and new beginnings, while the bride's path was strewn with flowers and coins. At the threshold of her new home, she paused. To enter willingly was dangerous. It might offend the household gods. And so, by custom, she was lifted and carried across, a gesture both protective and symbolic. She belonged now to a new household, under the protection and power of her husband. The night ended with the ritual cry of Talasio, a word of uncertain origin, perhaps recalling an ancient wedding song, perhaps the name of a Roman warrior whose marriage had become legendary. Whatever its roots, the shout rang through the streets, proclaiming joy, legitimacy, and divine sanction. But beneath the revelry lay an unspoken truth. Marriage was less about passion than about continuity. Love, if it blossomed, was a welcome gift, but not the goal. The true purpose was alliance, heirs, and stability. A Roman wedding, with its veils and torches, its sacrifices and songs, bound individuals not only to each other, but to the vast machinery of family and state.
In those moments, when laughter echoed through marble streets and the veil glowed like fire beneath the stars, Rome reminded itself that desire might be fleeting, but duty endured.
If Roman weddings were woven with fire and ritual, Roman divorces were marked by their startling simplicity. Love could be complex, but untying its bonds required little more than words. A husband, or in some cases a wife, needed only to declare, "Tuas res tibi habito," take back your things. With that, a marriage dissolved, as swiftly as parchment set to flame. Divorce carried no shame in early Rome. It was pragmatic, a tool to preserve family honor or secure better alliances. By the late Republic, it was common enough that Cicero, Seneca, and even Caesar spoke of it without scandal. Marriage was not a vow of eternal devotion, but a contract, and contracts could be broken. But behind the legality lurked betrayal and bitterness. A wife cast out might return to her father's house in disgrace, her dowry reclaimed, her children remaining with her former husband. For men, divorce could mean a reshuffling of alliances, a chance to pursue political gain by marrying into another powerful family. But for women, especially those discarded without cause, it could mean ruin. Adultery, though rampant, was dangerous ground. For centuries, Rome had no strict laws against it, treating it as a private family matter. But under Augustus, morality became state business. The Lex Julia de Adulterias criminalized unfaithfulness. Husbands were compelled to divorce adulterous wives, and fathers could even kill a daughter caught in the act. Betrayal was no longer just personal, it was political, an affront to the moral order Augustus sought to impose. And yet, desire ignored law. Poets wrote of forbidden affairs as if they were the truest form of passion, precisely because they defied duty. Ovid, with mischievous delight, instructed lovers on how to cheat cleverly, even in crowded forums or under the gaze of watchful fathers. His words were not just scandalous, they were dangerous, undermining the very foundations of Roman virtue. But betrayal cut deeper than adultery. To betray a spouse in Rome was to betray a lineage, a legacy, a future. Divorce could sever alliances, unravel dynasties, or topple reputations built over generations. Caesar's own daughter, Julia, beloved of Pompey, was mourned not only for her death, but for the collapse of the bond between two powerful men. Love and loyalty were always entangled with politics, and betrayal was rarely confined to the bedroom. So in Rome, to stand at the altar was to gamble. One might find devotion, or one might one day hear the chilling words, "Tuas res tibi habito," take what is yours and nothing more.
In Rome, desire was never free from the shadow of death. To love was to risk, for passion could ignite glory, but just as often summon ruin. The poets knew this well. Catullus spoke of kisses that burned beyond count, yet his verses trembled with grief for a love that devoured him. Desire in Rome was fierce, but it was fragile, always balanced on the edge of mortality. Death itself wove into the fabric of intimacy. Widows dressed in dark garments, their hair unbound, their mourning both a duty and a display. Yet the Romans were practical. Marriage could be remade, and widows often remarried swiftly, not from coldness, but from necessity. In a society where alliances kept the state alive, love could not linger forever in tombs. Still, some carried their devotion to the grave. Epitaphs etched on stone across the empire whispered of bonds that endured beyond life. A husband praising his wife as univira, a woman who had wed only once, was offering both affection and honor, for fidelity beyond death was rare and revered. In those lines carved into marble, one sees glimpses of genuine tenderness,
the ache of a heart unwilling to let go. But desire could also summon death in more violent ways. Passion unchecked was dangerous. Tales abounded of lovers slain in jealous rage, of husbands who exacted vengeance with the blade, justified by law and custom alike. To betray love in Rome was not only to break trust, but to gamble with survival. And there was another death, the symbolic one. Women who fell from virtue were said to be dead to their families, exiled in shame, erased from memory. In this sense, desire itself carried the power of annihilation, not just of flesh, but of identity. Yet Rome was haunted by the paradox. Love was fleeting, death eternal, and yet they intertwined endlessly. Funeral rites were filled with the language of devotion. Torches that once lit weddings now burned at gravesides. The same gods who presided over birth and marriage received offerings at the hour of loss. To the Roman mind, desire was not separate from mortality, it was a reflection of it. Love burned so brightly precisely because it could be extinguished in an instant. To embrace was to defy the silence of the tomb, if only for a heartbeat. And so in Rome, desire and death danced together, a reminder that passion, like empire itself, was mortal, yet capable of leaving behind echoes carved in stone, verses whispered through centuries, and ashes that still glowed with memory.
If Roman swords carved empires, Roman words carved hearts. For in Rome, love was not only lived, it was spoken, sung, and etched into eternity. Language itself became a theater where desire played its most dangerous games. Poetry was the purest vessel of passion. Catullus, reckless and raw, confessed his torment in verses that still tremble with life. Kisses without number, sleepless nights, the fury of betrayal. His words were intimate weapons, each poem a dagger and a kiss. Ovid, by contrast, turns seduction into instruction. His Ars Amatoria was a handbook of love, teaching Romans how to glance in the forum, how to slip notes in secret, how to bend language until it became caress. But language of love was not confined to poets. In the streets, on wax tablets, in whispered corners of the atrium, lovers traded coded messages. Slaves carried letters folded tight, words that could alter fates more swiftly than any sword. A phrase, a jest, a vow. These were the sparks that ignited scandal or sealed lifelong devotion. In marriage, words were binding, sacred. The formula spoken at the altar, the solemn "Ube tu Gaius, ego Gaia," where you are Gaius, I am Gaia, was more than ritual. It was surrender of identity into unity. Yet the same society that revered this vow also permitted its undoing with words just as simple. Tuas res tibi habeto. Language could bind, but it could also cut. Even in death, love spoke. Tombs across Rome bore epitaphs etched with tenderness. To my sweetest wife, who lived with me in harmony for 30 years. These inscriptions transformed grief into poetry, ensuring that the silence of the grave still carried the echo of devotion. But perhaps the greatest language of Roman love was not written in ink or stone, but in performance. Lovers crafted themselves through words, the boast of conquest, the plea of longing, the promise of fidelity. In the Senate, in the Forum, in the home, every phrase could carry double meaning, every speech a hidden declaration. For Rome was a city where power and passion mingled, where rhetoric ruled, and where to speak of love was to risk exposure.
Words could conceal as much as they revealed, weaving a veil of charm around desire. Thus, in Rome, the language of love was never merely personal. It was political, poetic, perilous.
Rome was a world where men spoke loudly. Senators in the forum, generals on the battlefield, poets in their verses. Yet beneath this chorus of masculine power, women's voices carried in quieter, more fragile ways. They were rarely given the stage, but they found their language, in whispers, in laments, in letters, in the carved lines of stone. For the Roman woman, speech was both weapon and risk. Society taught her silence, obedience, modesty. The ideal wife was univera, faithful to one man, chaste in body and restrained in tongue. Yet even within these confines, women spoke. Their words slipped into history not through speeches in the Senate, but through the intimacy of survival. Some voices reached us in fragments. Sulpicia, a poetess of the Augustan age, dared to write of her own desire. Her verses, startling in their candor, proclaimed a love not hidden but claimed. At last love has come, I do not hide it. In a world where female passion was often erased, Sulpicia's poetry was an act of rebellion, a declaration that a woman could not only feel but also speak her desire. Others spoke in epitaphs, carved on tombs by grieving husbands or children. These were women remembered for their gentleness, their weaving, their devotion to hearth and family. Yet sometimes a different tone broke through, a woman praising her own virtue, or a husband honoring not only fidelity but friendship. In those rare lines, we glimpse marriages built on affection rather than duty, partnerships where a woman's voice was heard in life and remembered in death. Letters, too, carried their voices. Roman women managed estates, arranged alliances, negotiated dowries. Behind the walls of the domus, they wielded influence, and their correspondence revealed sharpness of mind and subtlety of speech. Though few survive, enough remain to remind us that women's voices were not absent, only overlooked. And there were other voices, less gentle, more dangerous. Women accused in scandals. Clodia, accused by Cicero of being a temptress. Messalina, whispered about in tales of lust and betrayal. Whether true or slander, these stories reveal that women's speech was feared. To speak too boldly, to desire too openly, was to risk being painted as monstrous. But in songs, in lullabies, in prayers whispered at the household shrine, Roman women's voices endured. They sang over infants, pleaded with gods, wept at funerals. They shaped the rhythms of love and grief in the private sphere, even as men dominated the public one. Thus, though history often muffled them, women's voices in Rome still resonate, soft yet unbroken, layered with longing, tenderness, defiance. They remind us that the story of Roman love was not only told by men's tongues and poets' pens, but also by the whispers of women who dared to speak, even when the world preferred their silence.
Where love burns bright, betrayal waits in shadow. In Rome, passion was not only a gift, it was a danger. The same city that exalted devotion also became a stage for treachery, jealousy, and ruin. Adultery was not merely a private sin, it was a public crime. Under Augustus, laws branded it as a stain against family and empire. A husband might disown a wife, a father could even kill a daughter caught in the act. Love that strayed beyond its boundaries became a battlefield where honor and shame were at war. Yet, betrayal was not always punished. The whispers of Rome tell of liaisons carried on in the dark, of noble matrons slipping out in disguise, of men risking everything for forbidden embraces. Behind closed doors of the atrium, in secluded gardens, in shadowed porticos, betrayal unfolded like theater, hidden yet known to all.
Some betrayals shook empires. Julius Caesar's rumored affair with Servilia, the mother of Brutus, cast a shadow that history could never erase. Was Brutus's dagger driven only by politics, or did it carry the echo of his mother's love for Caesar? Passion became poison, and betrayal was written into the fate of Rome itself. Others were more personal, yet just as devastating. Ovid's verses sang of lovers deceived, of vows broken, of hearts abandoned. He warned of beauty's treachery, of the fleeting faith of men and women alike. In the language of Rome, betrayal was as common as devotion, two sides of the same coin. For to betray in love was not only to wound the heart, it was to fracture reputation, to invite ridicule, to risk exile. A woman accused of infidelity could be cast aside, stripped of dowry, her name spoken with scorn. A man caught in betrayal might face disgrace, but more often he wielded the privilege of silence. Still, betrayal lingered not only in law and scandal, but in the quiet ache of the human soul. Tomb inscriptions sometimes hint at bitterness, lives cut short, fidelity questioned, trust broken. The stones of Rome remember not only harmony, but also the fractures that love could not mend. For in Rome, to love was always to risk betrayal. Every vow carried the weight of potential treachery, every embrace the shadow of loss. Betrayal was not the exception, it was woven into the fabric of desire itself, a constant reminder that passion could wound as deeply as it could heal.
Rome was a city of rules, laws, rituals, hierarchies carved into stone. Yet beneath the order, desire ran wild, flowing where it was not permitted, seeking what it was denied. These were the forbidden loves, whispered in shadows, hidden in verse, lived in secrecy and risk. Some were loves across class, a senator and his slave, a patrician woman and a gladiator. The gulf between status was vast, yet desire leapt across it. The household itself was a dangerous stage. Slaves were near, always present, bodies within reach. Roman law said these unions were not marriages, but property and possession. Still, affection grew in unlikely places. Masters falling in love with those they owned. Slaves giving loyalty not from chains, but from attachment. Such bonds blurred the lines Rome tried to draw. Others defied gender's boundaries. In a world where masculinity was power and femininity submission, same-sex passions unsettled the Roman order. Men took male lovers, poets wrote of their beauty, and statues celebrated youth's grace. Yet the moralists grumbled. To desire was acceptable, but to yield, to play the passive role, was to risk being mocked, unmade as a Roman man. Women too found tenderness with women, though their voices are faint, smothered by silence. Still, in rare verses, in quiet allusions, the truth survives. Love refused to be confined. Then there were the dangerous affairs of blood. Incest, though whispered as horror, laced through the imperial courts. Emperors were accused of taking sisters, mothers, daughters into their beds. Some of these tales were surely slander, sharpened by politics. Yet the very fact they were told shows the fear Rome held, that desire, when unbound, could devour the sanctity of family itself. Religion too marked its lines. Vestal virgins, sworn to chastity for 30 years, stood as symbols of Rome's purity. To touch them was death for both the man and the maiden. Yet stories survive. of forbidden passion breaking even this most sacred vow. The punishment was brutal. The man executed, the Vestal entombed alive, left only with a lamp and a loaf of bread. Here, forbidden desire was not just personal, it was cosmic, believed to endanger the safety of the city itself. Yet despite the laws, the punishments, the shame, forbidden desires endured. Lovers found ways, through coded letters, secret trysts, the complicity of night. Poets cloaked them in myth, telling of Jupiter's disguises, of Venus's betrayals, of Ganymede lifted to the heavens. Desire, after all, was as much divine as it was human, a force no decree could fully silence. Rome tried to regulate love, to confine it within the boundaries of duty and law, but desire, wild and restless, spilled beyond every wall. The forbidden became not only sin, but story, tales that survive precisely because they carried danger, because they dared to defy.
Rome is dust now. Its temples lie in ruin, its marble shattered, its voices hushed. Yet the loves of Rome, their passions, betrayals, devotions, and desires still breathe within us. They remind us that though centuries pass, the human heart remains the same. From the ashes of Roman marriage rituals, we inherit echoes of our own. Rings exchanged, vows spoken, feasts shared. Rituals of union born in their atriums still find life in ours. When a bride walks to her husband's home, when hands are joined in promise, the shadow of Rome lingers. From Roman poetry, we inherit the language of love itself. Ovid's playful seductions, Catulus's raw ache, Propertius's devotion. They were the first to turn the chaos of desire into verse that survives across millennia. Each poem is a bridge across time, whispering that love has always been both joy and torment, both delight and wound. Even their warnings endure. Betrayal, once punished by law, is now judged by the heart, but the sting is unchanged. Forbidden desires once whispered in secrecy now speak with more freedom, yet their struggles mirror those of Rome. The empire's fears, its taboos, its longing for order, all still haunt us, dressed in new names, wearing modern clothes. The legacy of Roman love is not in statues or inscriptions alone. It is in the way we live, the way we ache, the way we reach out to one another despite the risks. Their devotion shows us the beauty of faithfulness. Their betrayals remind us of the fragility of trust. Their forbidden passions reveal the unstoppable hunger of the human spirit to seek connection, no matter the boundaries. Rome has fallen. Its armies are gone, its empire scattered to the winds. But the heart of Rome, the heart that loved, that longed, that burned, still beats in us. We are their heirs, not only in power, not only in law, but in love itself. For love, like empire, rises and falls, yet never truly dies. It is the one legacy no ruin can erase, no silence can bury, no time can destroy. And so, as the last echoes of Rome fade, its greatest truth remains. To love is to be human, and to be human is to leave behind a story that endures.